Okay, hello everybody, welcome. Good to see you again. So last week we started the book of Samuel, and we did a bit of an introduction, and we started chapter 1, and we got up till or we did through actually verse 9. Or whatever, up to verse 9, and we see a situation where Hannah and Peninnah, the two rival wives, sister wives, as they're sometimes called, and how upset Hannah is from the fact that she doesn't have children. And you have a sense that there's a certain amount of arrogance or mocking that's going on there on the part of Peninnah. Because we have in verse 6, her rival to make her miserable would taunt her that the Lord had closed her womb. So it's not only that she doesn't have children, but she is living in this family where the other wife has many children and is making her feel terrible about it. Okay, so this has come to a climax, and we have in verse 9, she gets up and she goes to the tabernacle, and there she meets Eli, the high priest, and he's sitting on a seat near the doorpost of the temple. And that's very interesting because Eli, this is where we first meet him, sitting on a chair in front of the tabernacle. And when we finally, the end of Eli, a few chapters down, we'll read the end of his story, he's sitting in the very same position at the very same place. But anyway, in verse 10, in her wretchedness, she prayed to the Lord, weeping all the while. And you can see that with the description here, not just that she's praying, but that she's putting her whole heart and soul into it. She's crying, she's bitter, and then she makes a vow, okay? And the vow is that if God will grant her a child, she will dedicate this child to the Lord. Okay, that's the first thing. And she makes the second part of the vow, then no razor shall ever touch his head. And we last week we also talked about some comparisons between the birth story of Samuel, and one of the stories we compared it to was Samuel, where there are differences, but these are two parts of the story are very similar, and both of them will be, we can assume here that this is a sort of Nazirite kind of thing, that like Samson, Samuel will be a Nazirite from birth. But unlike Samson, where the angel instructed Manoach's wife that this is what had to be, in this case, this is her own voluntariness. It's part of her oath to what she's going to do with Samuel. And of course, this dedicating him to the Lord all the days of his life is a very, she ends up bringing him to the temple, to the tabernacle, but it's a very, very enormous sacrifice. But anyway, then we move on and we see Eli again, and she's continuing to pray. And it says here, verse 13, now Hannah was praying in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Okay, so I guess he sees this woman very emotional, crying, moving her lips, but he's not hearing her say anything. So he's thinking this is a crazy woman. Now, it seems that at this point in time, this was not a usual way to pray. Now, I have to say that our sages, in giving us recommendations on how we should pray and drawing forth the rules of prayer. Now, we have, in Jewish traditions, we have two kinds of prayer. We have spontaneous prayer that everybody prays what they want, when they want, your own conversation with God. But we also have a great deal of prayer that is set in advance, that has been written down even 2,000 years ago. Most of the prayers, we have a prayer book, and there are different parts of the prayer. Most of the prayers are actually just reading things from scripture or from Psalms, but there are prayers that have also been created. And these prayers were actually created, formal prayers were created after the destruction of the Second Temple. Where there was a feeling of a need to create an institution of prayer to replace the institution of sacrifice and the temple worship. And so our sages tell us that when they were trying to give recommendations and set some of the laws of prayer, they learned it from Hannah's prayer. So at the time, Hannah is actually a revolutionary of sorts. This idea of moving your lips, saying words, but not being heard. And that is exactly how we pray. We pray in Judaism, we do not speak out loud. The only time there is prayer out loud is when you're with a congregation and the cantor or the person leading the prayer will sometimes recite some of the prayers out loud so everybody can hear it, but it is after everybody has said those prayers to themselves. Because the idea is when you're talking to God, it's your conversation with God, it's private. Even if you're saying the same thing as your neighbor is saying, it's private. You're speaking directly to God. And yet, you're supposed to move your lips. Why? Because it is supposed to be a conversation. Now, usually when you have a conversation with a person, if you only move your lips and you don't make yourself heard, the person you're talking to won't know what you're talking about. Unless, of course, you're talking to someone who's hearing impaired, and then they can read your lips. But that's an unusual situation. And that's exactly what Hannah is doing here. And she creates this whole concept of prayer, which clearly was not common because Eli doesn't recognize what she's doing. This idea of speaking directly to God, but moving your lips so that you're actually saying something. You're not just letting it sit in your heart for God to know what you're saying. You know, of course, God knows what you're thinking, but there's this idea of actually coming forth and moving your lips and saying something, but keeping it personal, keeping it between you and God. Anyway, so he thinks she's drunk and he accuses her. He says, get rid of your wine. Now, I find this also he looks at this woman. I find Eli here to be a very disturbing character in many ways. I mean, he's okay in the end, but he's very disturbing already here. And we'll see later on that he gets greatly criticized by God. But I see the roots of all of that, what we're seeing here. Okay. And I think this chapter is not only telling us about Samuel's birth, but it's also laying the background or laying the foundation for what we're going to learn about Eli afterwards. Now, I pointed out last week that already at the very beginning, in verse 3, Elkanah is going with his family up to Shiloh, and we learn there are the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Pinchas, priests to the Lord. And I remember I said then last week, why are we meeting the sons before we meet the father, right? Eli is the main guy. Why him? And that also kind of plays into this foreshadowing. There's problems in the tabernacle, and this is to tell us the problems are those two sons. Now here we have Eli, who immediately attacks this woman who is coming and crying. Why does he assume she's drunk? Why doesn't he first address the fact that she's clearly upset? Why doesn't he first say to her, what is troubling you, my dear? Okay, no. And first he accuses her of being drunk. So I think that is extremely disturbing about him. But there's also something else that I find very, very interesting. Okay, if you I'm going to send you back now to Leviticus. Okay, now in Leviticus, chapter 10. Right, let me just see if I can find this. I don't find it right away. I'm pretty sure it was in chapter 10, but I found it. Leviticus chapter 10, verse 9. Okay, this happens right after the two sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, go into the tabernacle, bring a strange fire, as it says. We're not quite sure what that is, but whatever. And they are struck down by God. Okay, and it is not clear what it is they did wrong. What we do see is right afterwards in verse 8, God says to Aaron, he gives him this instruction. And you think to him, like, what does this instruction have to do anything? This instruction is drink no wine or other intoxicant, you or your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die. This is a law for all time throughout the ages. Now, there are some people that make a connection between this instruction and the fact that we don't really know what the sons of Aaron did, to say maybe one of the problems of what the sons of Aaron did was that they were intoxicated when they went into the tabernacle. It could be. But for what I'm trying to point out now, it doesn't really matter. What we do know is there's a very, very clear instruction to Aaron that when he and his sons go into the tabernacle, they must not be drunk. They must not have drunk wine or other alcoholic beverage. So here we see Eli, who is the high priest, who it is his responsibility to make sure that neither he nor his sons have had anything to drink. And I find it is already making a statement. Okay, this is all he's worried about. His sons, we find out later, his sons are corrupt, are doing all these terrible things, but he's making sure nobody's coming into the tabernacle drunk. To the point that he's not only making sure his sons don't come into the tabernacle drunk, I assume they're coming and doing all kinds of other things, but the first thing he thinks about when he's looking at this poor Hannah with all her troubles is maybe she's drunk. And I think this something is going on here, that scripture is giving us these details because they're trying to say to us, pay attention. Eli there's a problem here. Even though Eli appears to be on the whole a very righteous, God-fearing man, but you see just little elements here that are problematic, and this is one of them. Okay, anyway, she of course stands on her own, and she explains to him, I am not drunk, but I am a miserable woman, and I've poured out my soul to God. And he says, don't treat me as a bad person. I'm not evil. And don't take me for a worthless woman. I've just been speaking to God of all these things. Now, she does not tell Eli what it is that she's asked for and what her trouble is. But he doesn't really say what will happen, but he does say, may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. Okay, so basically from at the outset, it seems he's been rebuked and he accepts it, and he feels bad, and so he wishes her that whatever it is she did pray for, God will give her what she prayed for. Now, very interesting, in the Hebrew, the word for what you have asked for, okay, it says shelatech. Now, in Hebrew, the word she'elah is an ask or a request, okay? So this seems to be what it's saying, except the A part of that word is left out. Instead of saying she'elatech, it says shelatech. It leaves out that word aleph. So most people read this and say, okay, it left out the aleph. We all get what it's talking about. It's talking about, please, and through within the context, may your request be answered. But what's very interesting is the word shelah or shilia, okay? And this is a biblical word for the afterbirth. And so it could be very much as a play on words here. May God grant you an afterbirth. In other words, may God grant you a child, which is, I think, it is really beautiful. And it could be something that came to Eli prophetically, that maybe at some level he does know what she's asking for. Anyway, okay, she comes back, and this in and of itself makes her feel better. It says she goes in verse 18. So the woman left, and she ate and was no longer downcast. Now, the way the Hebrew says that she's no longer downcast, it says her face was no longer as it was, her face. And if you remember last week, we talked about face. We talked about this weird way of saying in verse 5 that Hannah was given a double portion, but using the word apayim, which is a word for a nose or for a face. And this idea that that in a way we were either it's a double portion, or we used other commentaries that say it is to Elkanah was giving to us, so to change her face, to turn her from anger to something kinder. And the whatever it is he gave her to eat didn't do the trick. But when she prayed and she got this promise, which she believes to be prophetic from Eli, that changed her face. And here she is able to go back with a whole different face. Okay. And then they go home. And then it says, of course, that she gets pregnant and she has a son and she calls him Samuel. Now, this is interesting. It says she called his name Samuel, which in Hebrew is Shmuel, because he has been borrowed or asked of the Lord. And it could be either borrowed or asked. It's the same word in Hebrew. And of course, both of those words make sense because she asked for a child and now she got one from God. And the idea of borrowed, because she is now going to bring him to God, is if she's borrowed him for a bit, but now she's going to return him to God. Okay, she's going to bring him to the temple, to the tabernacle, and that's interesting as well. And it kind of fits in with the name itself. Shmu is like Shmo. It's like his name is God, and then you take out the m sound and you get the sound she'el, which is like ask or, borrowed. So it's a kind of play on words there as well. Okay, so they go after he's been born and whatever, and it comes time again for Elkanah to go back to the tabernacle. And we have an interesting detail here in verse 21. It says, they're going up to offer to the Lord the annual sacrifice and his votive sacrifice. Now, I don't know what votive means, but what it means in Hebrew is when you, a neder is an oath, okay? And or a vow. It's the same word for the vow that Hannah took. She took a vow, if God does this or that, I will bring my son to him. Well, it was a very common practice, and it's also mentioned in Leviticus as a certain type of sacrifice that a person would say in requesting something of God. He would ask God, if you will give me this, if you will fulfill my wish or whatever, I vow to bring a sacrifice to the Lord. So it says here that Elkanah he's going again to the tabernacle and he's bringing the sacrifices that he vows. So we see Elkanah is very vow oriented, which could be how Hannah came up with this idea of a vow. A vow is kind of doing a deal with God sometimes. It's not necessarily encouraged, but in ancient times it was much more common than it is today. And so the idea being, she's clearing a family where they're doing this, where they're asking God for things and then say, well, God, if you grant me what I'm asking for, I will do A, B, and C. And the more typical thing to do is not what she did. I'm going to bring my son, but I'm going to bring a sacrifice. So you see here that he's very careful about this. You have the sense he keeps a list. What were my vows this term? And then he goes to the tabernacle and he brings them. Okay. But she, of course, says she's not ready to go yet. She wants to wait till he's older. And what does Elkanah say to her in verse 23? Do as you think best. Stay home until you have weaned him. May the Lord fulfill his word. No, that's not what it says. I'm reading the English like just what it says, but what he says, but you should know the Lord will fulfill his word. In other words, there is this idea of him saying to her, but don't think you can get away with keeping Samuel at home forever. The Lord expects you to keep your word, and he keeps his word. You are expected to keep yours as well. That is kind of like what he's saying to her then. Okay, and then that happens, and she weans him, and then she brings him, and she comes to him, and she says, this is the child that, if you recall, I was praying for this child. And it's very interesting because we never know in the actual story that we read before that she ever says to Eli what it was she was praying for. But you assume from here that I guess at some point after the whole thing happened and they finished their conversation, she did actually say to him, and by the way, what it is I've asked for is a son, and I've made this vow. So anyway, she brings him to him. And then we get to chapter 2. And chapter 2 is amazing. It's all a poem, or most of it, not all of it, but the first 10 verses, and that's what we're going to do today, is her song of thanks. The word in Hebrew for this kind of a poem is a shir, and that is a song, and it's different. There's different ways to thank God. Okay, there's an ordinary prayer. There's a prayer of thanks. There's Hallel, that's praises of God, like in Psalm, I think it's like 113, 118. That whole area is full of praise to God. Starting from 113, we take verses 113 through a song of this outpouring kind of song. An example is the Song of Moses right after the parting of the Red Sea, where you have this amazing miracle that has just happened. And therefore Moses and the people of Israel burst forth in this beautiful song. It's really a poem. And it's not just praising God, it's this unbelievable gratitude for what has happened. And this is what this is. This is her personal song, her personal outpouring of gratitude to God. And it sounds, and you can see, just look at the first verse. My heart exalts in the Lord. I have triumphed through the Lord. I gloat over my enemies. I rejoice in your deliverance. It's just this amazing excitement. But I gloat over my enemies, okay? And we're going to see that this kind of plays a role here. As we're reading through this, we see that it's not just that she had a child and that she's so pleased with having a child, but it's such a painful experience to her, what she suffered at the hands of Peninnah. And then she talks, of course, in verse 2, she praises God. There is no holy one like the Lord, etc. But then looks what she says in verse 3. Talk no more with lofty pride. Let no arrogance cross your lips. For the Lord is an all-knowing God. By him, actions are measured. And she's clearly, what is she talking about? She's talking about people who are arrogant, people who are pride. And she's clearly referring to Peninnah, who's walking around and for years. I mean, I have to assume that Hannah was the first wife. Elkanah married her first. He loves her dearly. He's clearly the favorite wife. If he had married, he marries her, he loves her. Why does he take a second wife? Probably, and again, this is an assumption, he probably took a second wife because she wasn't bearing him children. So she takes Peninnah, and Peninnah, he takes Peninnah, and Peninnah bears him lots of children. But he continues clearly to love Hannah best. So there is Hannah, and she's made to feel by this Peninnah like worthless because she can't have children, and Peninnah has all these children. And we saw this in chapter 1, but here she is turning to Peninnah and she says, no, don't be so arrogant. You think you're better than everybody, but it's not true. It is up to God, and God knows who gets what. It has nothing to do with how wonderful you are. You are not more wonderful because you had all these children, okay? Just leave it in God's hands. And it's a very strong rebuke that is coming from her, clearly aimed at Peninnah. Okay, and then we go, she says like that in verse 5, men once sated must hire out for bread, men once hungry hunger no more. While the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn. Okay, so she starts this by saying, in continuation, this is all really God's decision. Don't gloat over what you have. Because today you may be on top of the world and tomorrow you may be at the bottom. And this is a circle of fortune kind of thing. And then she, of course, brings herself into it. While the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn. Okay, now she is singing this song after she brings Samuel to the tabernacle. He's a few years old. She clearly does not yet have 7 children. We know she will have 7 children because at the end of not the end, but a few verses later, in verse 21, we read, for the Lord took note of Hannah, she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Young Samuel, meanwhile, grew up in the service of the Lord. So we know that she had at least 5 children. Maybe she had 6, because it could be these were 5 children after Samuel. So she had at least 5 and possibly 6 children. And so clearly she's not talking about, see, I've already born 7, but she is talking, I think, from a place of faith and maybe even an element of prophecy where she's saying the tables are turned. I was once the barren woman, But now I'm on a roll. I'm going to have 7 kids, or at least I could have 7 kids. And of course, she comes close to it. But then she says, the mother of many is forlorn. Okay. And this might be an indication of what we talked about before. And remember Rachel and Leah. Leah was miserable, even though she was the one who was blessed with children. And in a way, she should have been very happy. And Rachel is very upset because she doesn't have children. But at the end, Rachel's the one who has Jacob's love and Leah doesn't. And it could be very similar here. All that time that Hannah didn't have children, Hannah still was the one who really got Elkanah's love, not Peninnah. But Peninnah could kind of comfort herself and say, well, at least I have all these kids, you know? And maybe now, once Hannah has children, by definition, Peninnah is forlorn because she has no longer anything to tie Elkanah to her. I mean, she's married and I'm sure he looks out for her, but he never did love her. And so at one point she felt she was special because she had the children. Now Hannah also has the children. And so it's sad. This whole situation is very sad, but Hannah is expressing it from her perspective. She has suffered a long time, and now she's able to say, you know what? The tables are turned. And she's a message, I think, is an eternal message. Don't be arrogant. Don't think it's all about you, because the tables can turn in a moment. And what she's referring to here clearly is her own personal situation. Okay, and then of course she talks about God. God deals death, he gives life, casts down to the grave and raises up. The Lord makes poor, makes rich, all this kind of, this idea that God controls things and don't think it's all you. If you're suddenly rich, don't think it's you. It's really God who's doing it. Now here I'd like to point out verse 8, because I find this very interesting. Verse 8 is as follows. He raises the poor from the dust, lifts up the needy from the dunghill, setting them with nobles, granting them seats of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world upon them. Now, as I'm reading this, I think to myself, wait. There is a very, very similar verse in Psalms. And if I look at Psalm 113, I see as follows. First of all, it starts very similar. Who is like the Lord our God, who enthroned on high sees what is below in heaven on earth. It's not the same words as what we have, but it's the same thought. But here we get to the identical words. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts up the needy from the refuse heap to set them with the great. Okay? Until here, it's really the same words, except in Samuel, in Hannah's song, it says, granting them, setting them with nobles, but in Hebrew, see, it's different. It's the same. In the English is different, setting them with nobles. In Hebrew, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. Okay, but in Psalms, it adds it a different line, with the great men of his people. Okay, so right here in her song, it's just, setting them with the great or setting them with the nobles. Okay, and granting them seats of honor. But in the Psalm, it says setting them with great men of his people. So you have a sense in Psalm 113, it's making someone great amongst the people, which is a sort of different context. Whereas here, it is just setting them great. And then it goes on to talk about granting them seats of honor, for the pillars of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world upon them. So the message here is continuation of what we said before. Someone who was in the dirt, God brings them up and then gives the answer, for the pillars of the earth are the Lord's. It is the Lord, it is God who really sets the foundations. In Psalm 113, though, he ends with an amazing verse, verse 9. He sets the childless woman among her household as a happy mother of children. Now, I look at 113 and I'm saying, wow, the psalmist is quoting Hannah's prayer. This is not a coincidence. They're talking about a very similar kind of thing. God is up there. He's in his perch. He rules over everything. He sees what's going on. He can make the difference about whether people are down in the depths or up in the skies and all that stuff. But The psalmist is taking it from Hannah. He's quoting her prayer and then saying, and by the way, what was the classic example? That he set the childless woman among her household as a happy mother of children. So as I said before, with our tradition said that we learn so much from Hannah's prayer, the psalmist himself is using Hannah's prayer and making sure we realize that it is a quote from Hannah's prayer, because he's saying, talking about the motherless children who now has children, which is I think is amazing. And so her prayer then is, on the one hand, a very personal prayer, but on the other hand, this idea of the barren woman having children becomes the example that can be used for every single situation in life. Whatever your misfortune is, it's almost as if to say the greatest pain may well be the childless woman. And if God can give the childless woman a child and change this woman from deep sadness to enormous joy, imagine how all these other things are just examples of the same thing. The ultimate is this idea of the childless woman will now have children. And this, of course, is something that she puts forth initially. And one last thing in verse 10, how does she end? The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king and triumph to his anointed one. And here, the word for anointed one is his Mashiach, which is Messiah. The word Messiah literally means anointed one. And who is it that we're talking about? The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. Okay, that's general. He will give power to his king and triumph to his anointed one. What is Samuel going to be? Samuel will be the man who anoints kings. He's going to anoint Saul, and then when that doesn't work out, he's going to anoint David. And so it becomes this is a prophetic prayer. Hannah may not know the details, but she does understand that something in what has happened in her bringing forth Samuel and bringing him into the tabernacle is going to give power to a king that God is choosing for to be anointed. And who will actually anoint him at God's commandment? Of course, it will be her son Samuel, which he probably doesn't know, but it is this prophetic word that gives us the introduction in her prayer. So that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I think we're taking a break next week. Yes, we're taking a break next week for 2 weeks because next week I'm already deep in the kitchen preparing for Passover. My last day of work is Sunday. Monday, I'm not to be found. Well, you are all welcome to join me in my kitchen. Any of you want to come and help me, I'll give you some eggs to crack, or no, you don't want to do that. But anyway, so
that might be fun. Set up your camera in the kitchen and show us your cooking.
Oh no, that's a mess. but yes, that's why I'll be next week, and the week after I will be enjoying Passover. So we will resume the Monday after Passover, which I think is the 17th of April, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, the 17th of April, we will be back.
We will resume on April 17th, and we will take up with verse 11 in chapter 2. Anybody have any comments? Now's the time.
Sondra, I missed the first
Yes.
couple of minutes. Did you say anything about the situation in Israel at the moment?
Only to say that it's a mess.
Yeah.
It really is a terrible mess. It's this protest against, look, I am in favor of the judicial reform, although I am certainly willing to consider ways to do it a little differently. I think that the government has to be listening to real comments and concerns and take them into account and see if we can come up with some better things. And I think they did make some compromises along the way, but there has been such bad feeling. There have been, the protests have gone way overboard. They have, from the beginning, set themselves as the protectors of democracy, and the reform being a threat to democracy, all of which is ridiculous. but on the other hand, there have been some comments made both by government ministers and by different people that have been not very helpful on the government side. But right now, just what has just happened now is that Netanyahu has announced that he's calling a halt to the reform. I don't understand why he didn't get involved earlier. I think it's not a halt, it's a break. It's not like we're not doing this anymore. It's that let's take a halt, wait until after the holidays and see if during this time we can come to some kind of an agreement. The problem is that the demonstrators who have gone way beyond anything that has ever been seen in demonstration in Israel in our history, the fact that army soldiers, officers, reservists were threatening not to obey orders, the fact that they're calling on a general strike, all these things are just so insane. The blocking highways, they set fire last night to a major highway. I mean, I don't understand what's going on here. And so it is extremely distressing. I am very in favor of discussion, conversation. I know there are very good people on both sides of this, and there are many people that are demonstrating who really and truly are concerned, and I want to calm their concerns and I want to listen to their concerns. But something has happened and it's not, I don't know. I think we really need some responsible leadership on both sides of the divide so they can have a conversation as opposed to yelling and screaming. So that's really what I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes.
Sondra, something that just strikes me when we were talking about Eli sitting in the doorway of the temple, the tabernacle, would he have been able to see everywhere within the temple from there? Because
He should have been able to see a lot. Are you asking, would he have seen what his sons were doing?
well, no,
Probably.
I'm asking actually out of curiosity as to whether the females were separated from males when they would go into the tabernacle, into the temple.
Well, if we don't have a lot of details of this in the tabernacle, but from the Second Temple period, we know more. There are different sections of the tabernacle, which were also patterned afterwards in the temple. So the Holy of Holies is this inner sanctum that only the high priest can go into once a year, and that's totally blocked off. Okay.
Mhm.
Then there's a part outside of that where you have an altar and where, a lot of the the sacrifices would be brought. And then beyond that, there's a courtyard. And in that courtyard, you would have had men and women,
Okay.
both. Now, were they separated at that point, like men on one side and women on another? We don't know. In other words, some people say, well, it would have had to be, and others say, well, there's no indication that there would have been. So it's not clear.
No.
But definitely that was a place for, you didn't have to be a priest, you didn't have to be a Levite, and it could be men and women. They had to be pure. Okay, there's, all the ritual purity that had to be gone through to come to the tabernacle. You had to be in a state of ritual purity to come to that courtyard, but that would have been everybody. And he would have been sitting somewhere there, either on the outskirts of that courtyard or between the courtyard and the entrance to the area where they brought the sacrifices.
Thank you.
Well, clearly
You're
he saw Hannah as she was praying.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for
So
sure.
he would have been, is that where you were coming from, Barbara? Is like, how did he see her? Like, because he thought she was drunk.
Well,
No,
yeah.
he saw her.
Yeah. But it explains it in the fact that, the temple as it is, or as it was later on, is very distinct, and you can see that. But the one at Shiloh was, I was just wondering what kind of size it was and whether the ruling was that the women had to be separated.
Well, the information that we have about the tabernacle comes from the book of Exodus, beginning in chapter 25, really until the end of Exodus. We have a great deal of detail about the different sections of the tabernacle, what goes where, and what the size was.
Yeah.
So it's based on that information.
It makes sense, and the fact I would suggest that Eli must have been at the inner side of that last part if you like, to have been able to see, because surely he would have been watching the people coming in. Does
Well,
that make?
it could have been, that's what I'm saying, he could have been either at the entrance to the outer courtyard,
Yeah,
in which case he would have been able to see who's coming in and also who's in that courtyard. And he may well have been in the entrance between the
Next one.
courtyard and the holier part where the sacrifices were, which may make more sense, because if he's the priest, he's going in and out of that section. So if he's sitting, that's where he would sit. Either place, he would have been able to see everybody in the courtyard.
that's lovely. Thank you.
You picked up on Eli's attitude to Hannah when she went in, you know, because he was really judgmental, wasn't he? And I just wondered whether something within Eli was a bad example to his sons, you know, they ended up so corrupt, whether that came out of Eli's own example down the years. Not
Look, it could be, I think that we get these hints of his character, that there is a problem there. And later on, there's a rebuke from God. Let's see. I don't remember. We're going to get to it, but at the end, basically, God gives him terrible. Here, I found it here. He says, a man of God comes to Eli. This is in chapter 2. And he talks to him. He says, you honored your sons more than me. Okay. And he says, well, he continues talking about, he talks about the 2 sons will die in the same day. But I think this is the most powerful thing. He says, you honored your sons more than me. You let them do whatever they wanted, even at the expense of desecrating the tabernacle. And that's basically what he did. And he didn't
Sandra,
pay attention. He didn't do it.
Sandra, didn't God tell him that the priesthood will remove from his family
That's
or
right.
something like that?
That's right. That's what happens afterwards. Yeah.
Mhm.
But when he tells him what he did wrong, that's how he expresses it. So it basically, it's clear he knows what was going on and he does nothing. And we'll see that. We're gonna study that. We probably will get to it. That'll be what we study the next time we meet, because it's continuing in chapter 2. All right.
Thank you. Thank
Anyway.
you. Kasha Samaya.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see each other in 3 weeks, I guess.
Have a
Okay.
joyous
Bye-bye.
Passover.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at cfoic.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.